It's my pleasure to introduce to you Timothy Renick. He's the Senior Vice President for Student Success and Professor of Religious Studies here at Georgia State University. At Georgia State, he served as the Chair of the Department of Religious Studies and Director of the Honors Program. Since 2008, he has directed the student success and enrollment efforts of the university, overseeing among the fastest improving graduation rates in the nation and the elimination of achievement gaps based on students' race, ethnicity, or income level. Dr. Renick has testified on strategies for helping university students succeed before the United States Senate and has twice been invited to speak at the White House. His work has been covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time, and CNN, and cited by President Obama. He was named one of 2016's most innovative people in higher education by Washington Monthly and was the recipient of the 2015-16 Award for the National Leadership in Student Success Innovation from the University Innovation Alliance. He currently is a principal investigator for the $9 million U.S. Department of Education grant to study the impact of predictive analytic-based advisement on 10,000 low-income and first-generation students nationally. A summa cum laude graduate of Dartmouth College, Dr. Renick holds an MA and a PhD in religion from Princeton University. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim Renick.
Yeah, thank you, Aristia. I appreciate that nice introduction. I should clarify, I did have the honor of speaking twice at the other White House. In 17 months, I've heard nothing recently. If any of you can explain what's going on, yeah, it's been much quieter in recent times. So again, an honor to greet you all here, welcome you to Atlanta and specifically to Georgia State. And what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is talk a little bit about some of the issues we're trying to work through at Georgia State. I've been doing this for, as you heard from Aristia, about 10 years now. Finances have been a critical part of what we've thought through. I don't know that we've come up with a lot of solutions, but I'm going to talk about some of the strategies we've employed. And for those of you who've heard me before, we're all about the data, so you're going to see actually some results that have followed from some of these strategies. But to get us started, not only in this discussion, but in the conference, let's start with some national data. In some ways, this sets the stage for the challenges in front of us and indicates why the work we're going to do over the next day is so important. First chart, this is from the New York Times. This is the percent of Americans who actually hold a college degree, but it's disaggregated by economic quartile. So it covers the last 40 years from 1970 to the present, and what you can see is there have been significant changes in bachelor's attainment across the United States, entirely in the upper half of the economic spectrum. So if you're among the 25% wealthiest Americans by annual household income, your prospects of holding a college degree have basically doubled over this time period. 40% of the population had a bachelor's degree back in 1970, now over 80%. That's fantastic. That's not the focus over the next 24 hours. It's not the focus of many of your efforts at the home campuses. Because if you look at the bottom of this chart, the picture is much more sobering. Among the 25% least wealthy Americans, there's been hardly any gain over the last generation, from about 6% of the population to 8% of the population. And what you can see very graphically here is the gap between the least wealthy and wealthiest Americans is not getting narrower. Basically, it's doubled. The gap has doubled over the last decade. You know, this is on us in this room, all of us who are working in the post-secondary sector, because we haven't delivered on the promise that we make to our students and their families to provide not only access to a college education, but actually the ability to complete the degrees. So we start with that national data. Now I'm going to layer on it some other national data. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we've crossed an important and historic threshold in the United States. Some of you have heard this data point before. For the first time in U.S. history, at least since these data have been collected, the majority of students in K through 12 public schools across the United States qualify as low income. About 52% of the pipeline to all of our campuses, all those students enrolled in K through 12, are by federal designation low income students. And for those of you in the South, Georgia, you can see, is right on that list, Texas on that list, Florida on that list. In fact, if you look at a national map and draw a line between basically California and almost the DC area, almost every geographical state below that line already has passed the 50% threshold. So you put these two pieces of information together, the New York Times chart showing how we've done as a nation in succeeding with low-income students, and the answer there is pitifully poor. And this data actually comes from the Southern Education Fund of the pipeline of students coming forward, which are going to be majority low income for the first time in any of our lifetimes in this room. And you've got a rather sobering picture for the future of our country, right? Individual families and then collectively. It's also a good introduction to where you are now, Georgia State University. For those new to visiting Georgia State, you now realize we are a true urban campus. This is not just a pretty picture of the Atlanta skyline. This is Georgia State. This is our largest academic building, now labeled 25 Park Place, but in great symmetry to the origins of this conference. This was once the headquarters for SunTrust Bank. And when they moved uptown to this very fancy, taller headquarters, we purchased the 25 Park Place building, and it's our largest academic building. Our business school is right next door, our law school there. One of our largest classroom buildings is across the park. We're just mixed into the fabric of downtown. We have over 32,000 students on this campus alone, 52,000 students across all of our campuses, including satellite campuses as well. And you know, the reality is for much of our history, we've been overshadowed by other institutions in our midst. We're not Georgia Tech. For those of you who want to visit Georgia Tech, you can almost walk there from here, about a little over a mile north of here. Also on the edge of downtown is Georgia Tech. We're not University of Georgia, the big football powerhouse and flagship up in Athens. 5 or 6 miles from here is also Emory University, one of the most prestigious elite institutions. If there's any claim to fame to Georgia State historically, it may be our geography. We have the very uncommon, it may even be unique distinction, at least for a major public university, of having a National Park Service Historic District slice our campus in half. The Martin Luther King Historic District on Auburn Avenue celebrates the life and work of the Reverend Martin Luther King. What an appropriate setting for this particular meeting. You go out of this building, out the main door, turn to your right, you're on Auburn Avenue. And if you walk about 5 blocks down Auburn Avenue, you will encounter Ebenezer Baptist Church, that brick building at the bottom of the screen there. That's the church where the Reverend King and his father before him were both head pastors. Walk a little further past that, you get to his gravesite, his tomb is right there on Auburn Avenue. And a little further, you find this mustard-colored house, which is the childhood home of the Reverend Martin Luther King. So this conference will be held, but more pertinently for my day-to-day life, I'm living and working on this geography that is infused with historical significance, right? What could be more sacred ground when it comes to talking about, you know, trying to empower underserved individuals than to be right here in the midst of where the Reverend Martin Luther King lived and worked. But the stark reality is that for much of Georgia State's history, we didn't live up to the legacy that the Reverend King represents. For one thing, we were segregated well into the 1960s. How sad an irony is that the institution a couple blocks away from this Nobel Prize winning leader's life and work is itself, you know, the very definition of the problem he was trying to combat. But more than that, much more recently than the 1960s, this is just about 15 years ago, we were grossly underperforming as an institution overall. Our graduation rates hovered around 30%, but more than that, we were a poster child for achievement gaps. Year after year, semester after semester, our white students outperformed our students of color, our upper income and middle income students outperformed our low income students, our students from multi-generational college families outperformed our first generation student. You know, you'd set your watch to it. Every year, you could depend upon that. In that respect, we were very typical. As a big urban university, we were underperforming, and we had huge achievement gaps. And what makes Georgia State's story important, I think, as an illustration of at least what's possible is the fact that what's happened in the years since these numbers were locked in would not suggest that Georgia State would be the site of a turnaround. For one thing, we were going through significant demographic changes over this period. I arrived at Georgia State fresh out of graduate school as a junior faculty member in religious studies, and at the time, Georgia State was a white commuter school. 70% of the students were white. We didn't have any housing on campus. That was the nature of this institution. But Georgia State is at the leading edge of demographic changes that are going through the entire nation. In fact, in some ways, going from the southern part to the northern part of the nation, as you saw in that map of the United States we were looking at a minute ago. And what's happened every year since I've been in this position is Georgia State has gotten not a little, but a lot more diverse year after year. About 12, 13 years ago, we became federally designated as an MSI, a minority-serving institution, because the majority of our students no longer white. And you can see that trend continues to the point now where this current academic year, just under 70% of our students are non-white. So we've gone from a 70% white institution to a almost 70% non-white institution, all in basically a generation. There's no majority population at Georgia State anymore. Our largest single group are African American students, about 39%. Our two fastest growing demographics are our Asian American and our Latino students. So this rich mix of demographic categories. But if you're in the student success business, this does not usually bode towards great gains and successes when it comes to graduation rates, because historically these are the students that have struggled more often than not to complete college. Another demographic change that occurred over this time period is the following. And to put it simply, over this time period, our students became a lot less well-resourced financially. The recession hit Atlanta very hard. It was a boom city before the recession, and then it plunged much more dramatically than most urban areas during the recession. At one point during the recession, Atlanta had both the highest unemployment rate and the highest mortgage default rate in the entire United States, at least among urban areas. And what we found is that the students who were hit hardest by the recession were predominantly not the sons and daughters of Emory and Georgia Tech, or even University of Georgia, which tends to enroll lots of middle and upper income students. It was the first generation, the low income, the students of color, the families that send their sons and daughters to Georgia State. These were the families losing their jobs, losing their homes, and so forth. And so in a very short period of time, really a 5-year period of time, we basically doubled the number of Pell students we enroll at Georgia State, from about 30% to almost 60% in a very short period of time. And when you go through these kind of demographic shifts, it's not going to be business as usual, right? You can't expect you can continue to do things in exactly the same way when your student population has changed in such a dramatic fashion. And putting this data side by side with the data we were looking at a minute ago from the New York Times, the other challenge we faced as an institution is we were increasingly enrolling the students we were least effective in graduating, right? So we weren't successful in graduating students of color. We were successful in graduating low-income students, and those were the students who we were increasingly enrolling. The sheer size of the challenge at institutions like Georgia State, but there are others like us represented in this room. We have colleagues from Miami-Dade College, FIU, and so forth. Huge numbers of low-income students. At Georgia State this academic year, we're enrolling 26,000 Pell students. The entire Ivy League combined this academic year enrolls about 9,800 Pell students. So Georgia State alone is educating almost 3 times the number of low-income students as the entire Ivy League combined. As I say, it's not going to be business as usual when that's the kind of demographic that you're facing. So what we did in the face of these kind of demographic shifts is get a lot more self-critical. We put the mirror on ourselves. We began to take data a lot more seriously and begin to analyze what we are doing as an institution that's tripping up, at the time, 7 out of 10 students. They're coming here with hopes and dreams and leaving with debt and nothing really to show for it. So we began investing in data and doing greater analytics. What I'm going to concentrate on for a moment or two are some of the data points we've been looking at as an institution, and for quite a while with regard to the financial health and well-being of our students. One of the things we've calculated for every student every year for the past 10 years is their level of unmet need. This is an audience who knows that term overall, but just for those who may be a little less familiar with the college context, unmet need is basically the difference between the resources that we can compile for a college student and the full cost of being a full-time student at that institution. So what we do is for every student at Georgia State, take the various sources that we have available. As you've heard, many of our students have Pell Grants. Most of our students take out some kind of loan. In the state of Georgia, there's this Hope Scholarship. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. There's a family contribution that is calculated by a federal formula. And we also layer onto that the assumption that students are working anywhere around 15 or so hours a week and contributing all of that income towards the full cost. In an ideal world, and this is the world many outsiders to higher education think still exists, then the resources that we compile for each student will at least equal the full cost of education. But the people in this room, I know most of you working on a day-to-day basis, live in a different world where even after you compile all those resources, many, many of your students fall short of having the full cost of education covered. There's a gap. And that gap we label unmet need. Now, I talked often to politicians. We're just a couple blocks here from the state capitol, and they will inevitably tell me the story of their own time in college if they've gone to college. In some political context now, that's a liability as well. But, and their claim will be that, oh, well, I had the same issue, but I took a job, or I took a couple jobs. But the finances and the dynamic of the economies of higher education were very, very different back then, and we're assuming the students are working 15 to 20 hours. So if you say they have a gap and they can fill it by working, what you're assuming is that the students, as a norm, are going to be working full-time and being full-time students at the same time. Now, what's troubling about this metric of unmet need is that it hasn't been getting better at Georgia State, it's been getting worse. So these are the levels of unmet need at Georgia State over the last decade or so, and what you can see is an upward trend. This is a chart you don't want to see the lines moving to the upper right here, because each time they do, it shows that the gap between what students have as resources and what they need is growing. There was a short dip in levels of unmet need at Georgia State in the first 2 years of the Obama administration because there was an increase in the average payout for the Pell Grant and also a broadening of eligibility, so more families qualified. But there was, we were hitting the depths of the recession. The state of Georgia made slashes to the Hope Scholarship Program and some other things going on, including an increase in tuition. And what we've seen since then is a steady increase in levels of unmet need. The average Georgia State undergraduate this past year has about $7,000 unaccounted for. After everything is put together, loans, family contributions, and work income, there's still a $7,000 gap. And what we saw when I first took over this position back in 2008 is something that was particularly disturbing about unmet need. We could find no better predictor of student academic performance than level of unmet need. So this is a simple chart. On the horizontal axis, we're just looking at levels of unmet need for Georgia State students. This is back in 2008, from those students who have all their need met all the way to those who have up to $15,000 unaccounted for. And what you see on the vertical axis is simply the percent of students within each of those bands who is able to hold on to a 3.0 GPA. And what you can see is a direct trajectory downward when students have more and more unmet need in their academic performance. For students with all their need met, over 60% were able to hold on to a 3.0 GPA. For those with high levels of unmet need, that number dropped, into the 20% range. So, this devastating toll to this often ignored and not even tracked metric of unmet need. And we became fascinated with it. I'll talk about some of the interventions we developed to try to mediate and mitigate some of these issues in just a minute. So what I'm going to do is discuss a few of the strategies we've developed to try to deal with these changing demographics and try to serve better the students we enroll on a regular basis at Georgia State. The first thing we've learned is we need to be far more proactive about guiding students through these very complex financial processes. I'm going to talk about one specific example of an intervention that is fairly recent here at Georgia State. Talk a little bit about summer melt. I think most of you are familiar with that term. Summer melt is the phenomenon of students doing everything right. They go to high school, graduate from high school, apply to college, take the ACT or SAT, get into college, confirm they're going to attend, in many cases even come to your campuses, register for classes, come to orientation and so forth, and never show up. I don't mean never show up to your institution. They never show up to college, period. They just melt away during that summer period. So we had a growing phenomenon with summer melt, the confirmed students for our Georgia State first-year class who just didn't come to the first day of classes, indeed didn't show up for the first semester. In 2015, we did an analysis of the entire cohort. What we found is among that group who were confirmed but didn't show up for the fall of 2015, there were almost 300 students who, a year later, hadn't attended a single day of post-secondary work anywhere across the United States. We use National Student Clearinghouse data to track them, say what happened to them. Did they end up at Georgia Tech, or did they end up at local technical college? No, they didn't end up anyplace. They just melted away during the summer. And when you look at the profile of these students, they're exactly the students we need to succeed with as a nation, right? Mostly non-white, mostly low income, really good students. These are not borderline high school graduates. They're graduating with above a B average from high school. But we're doing something during the summer that is causing them to melt away. So we got serious about what is that thing we're doing that's deflecting so many students who have come so far right before they cross into post-secondary enrollment. And so we did analysis. We found, sadly, almost embarrassingly, there were 14 different bureaucratic steps we require students to complete during the summer before their enrollment, so between graduating from high school and starting enrollment at Georgia State, in order to be prepared and ready for the first day of class. Mind you, at a time when they have no access to their high school counselors, and they're not yet on Georgia State's campus, so they're fending this on their own. We all know some of these steps, the completion of the FAFSA, something we would never expect any 17-year-old to pull off on their own from any economic background. But then things layer onto that, the verification process. We began to see how inequitable that was with regard to economic and racial background. Who gets selected for verification process? For those who might not be familiar with that term, just like when the IRS, you submit your taxes, the IRS runs an algorithm, they find certain returns that may be outliers, and those are more likely to get audited. So too, when you submit a FAFSA, there's a subset of the applications for federal financial aid that are selected by the federal government for verification. If you're the son or daughter of a middle-income family that file a joint return, not that likely to be selected. If you're being raised by grandma because your biological dad is not in the financial picture, bingo, you're much more likely to be selected for one of these verification requests. And what 17-year-old from any background is going to respond in a constructive way to a written request from the federal government in the middle of July that says, we need written verification that your grandma is your legal guardian and that your father is not contributing to the finances of your family. And what we found, not surprisingly, there were a subset of students who were taking that letter, sticking in their pockets and saying, yes, I'm not going to college after all. Immunization requirements. The state of Georgia requires all the students as they start college in the public system be immunized. A big differentiator again with regard to economic background, because those middle and upper income students, they don't give it a second thought. Hand it to mom or dad, they'll send my immunization records in, all handled. But that kid being raised by grandma who's had spotty health care, again, it can be the difference between enrolling or not. I don't have those records. I don't know where my grandma doesn't know where they are. I don't know if I even was immunized. Guess I'm not going to college. So each one of these steps was a turning point for a subset of the students who had every hope and intent of enrolling at Georgia State, but never quite did so. So for the summer of 16, we changed our onboarding process. We got much more intentional, in some ways similar to what Brian was suggesting is important for us to do. One thing we do now at Georgia State is as soon as a student is admitted to the university, they get a follow-up survey from us. It's delivered on smartphones and other sorts of electronic devices. On the survey, we ask all the questions you'd never ask on a college application. Do you have a disability? Are you working? Are you working and contributing to the finances of your family every month? Because we all know in this room, those of you on the campuses, that there's a subset of our students who are not only trying to pay for college, but still trying to support their family with rent and food and other sorts of costs. What courses in high school did you love? What courses in high school did you hate? The idea is that we want to, from the moment a student is first admitted to Georgia State, begin to communicate an individualized, personalized communication flow so that we can begin to speak to these students even during the summer in a much more individualized fashion. Then we created a portal. We worked with EAB on a portal that takes students through the 14 or so steps I was just describing. So each of these steps is outlined for the students with resources to help them through each of those steps. But the important thing is, because it's a portal, we can finally track where students are in this process. Used to be we knew a student was engaged and then they stopped, responding to our emails and our phone calls. Now we know a student was engaged until we asked for their immunization records, and then we stopped hearing from them, so that we can reach out specifically with constructive steps to help get them through that immunization requirement. Do you know that our health clinic offers immunizations, in the afternoon, 3 days a week, and so forth? Probably a third and probably most impactfully, we became one of the first schools in the country to use an AI-enhanced chatbot to try to promote student success. What's a chatbot? Chatbot is an automatic texting platform. What we did is we build up a knowledge base of over 2,000 answers to questions commonly asked by incoming college students. Questions about financial aid, the FAFSA, verification processes, but also about registration and immunization and all the other sorts of things that new college students ask about. We worked with a startup out of the Harvard incubator called AdmitHub to put that information on a smartphone so students could text questions 24/7, and if the answer is in the knowledge base, they would get an immediate response. The AI component actually helps locate, when a student texts a question, the right answer among the 2,000 answers in the knowledge base and pulls it out for the students. When we launched this experiment in the summer of 2016, we estimated that in the 3 months leading up to the start of classes, the chatbot will probably answer about 5,000 to 6,000 questions that our students have posed. In the 3 months leading up to the start of fall classes, the chatbot answered over 200,000 questions. Average response time was 7 seconds. We did, as we often do when we launch new pilots, we did both a data independent evaluation and we did a qualitative evaluation. What we found that was particularly interesting in the qualitative evaluation is that students admitted that they asked the chatbot questions they were reluctant to ask a human being. Right? They knew this was a tool. It was not only that it was on their smartphones and available 24/7, but it was non-judgmental. Right? A lot of first-generation low-income students feel everybody else understands or knows something and feels embarrassed about the questions they have. Or if you're that student who doesn't know where your biological dad is, but the federal form seems to require signatures from both parents, you might say, well, what do I do in that context? And be reluctant to go into some stranger's office or pick up the phone and spill out your family history to that individual. And what we found in mass, that students were much more comfortable getting these questions answered via the chatbot. So simple changes. Let's take the students step by step through the processes they need to complete. Let's give them a resource that will provide immediate answers to the questions they might have. Did it make a difference? It made a big difference. In 1 year, we reduced summer melt at Georgia State by 22%. Given the size of our incoming first-year class, that translates into over 300 additional students who a year before would be sitting out the college experience, who fall of 16 were there raring to go, ready to go. And the majority of these students, not surprisingly, were low-income, first generation, and students of color. Okay? Now, what's particularly important to our efforts over the next day or so is that about 70% of the questions that were asked via the chatbot were financial in nature. So these are the big stumbling blocks, but this is really a promising idea. It's also an idea that can be done collaboratively. You know, a lot of the work we did and build up the knowledge base was coming up with text-based answers to questions about federal financial aid. But questions and answers about federal financial aid are the same at your institution as they are at Georgia State, right? I mean, it's the same rules and policies and so forth. So we can build upon these sorts of experiments. And tomorrow, you'll be able to go to a drill-down session, learn a lot more about our use of the chatbot and some of the promise for what we can do going forward. Second strategy that we've had is try to identify problems early. What we've been shocked about by looking at the data is how quickly students can make what turn into fatal financial decisions, fatal to their prospects of graduating from college. In some cases, the decisions the students make that undermine their chances of graduating from college occur before they ever set foot on campus, even before they take their first class. So one of our big projects over the last 18 months has been a collaboration with SunTrust. A major part of this grant we received was the opening of a student financial management center. Maybe a couple of you took the option of touring this before we kicked off this afternoon. But this is like an advising center, except rather than the staff being trained in academic advice, they're trained in financial counseling. And rather than the old model of advising, which had dominated higher education for years, of passivity, of basically waiting for the students to come to us, we have gone beyond that model in academic advising at Georgia State. What we decided to do is be equally proactive, equally data-based through the mechanism of the SunTrust Student Financial Management Center. The early signs are very, very promising. So we fully opened the center up in January 2017. In what is now about 17 months, we've had over 182,000 contacts with students, 51,000 unique contacts with students through the Student Financial Center. And what we've seen is that the student behavior is beginning to change. You know, one marker is that more students are completing their financial requirements on time. So what are some of the drill down steps that we've been using to begin to drive these types of results? Well, one thing we're doing is looking at data to try to find early warning signs of students' distress. By the time a student is in debt and in collections and not paying their bill and getting dropped from classes, it's often too late to intervene financially. So the simple question we asked is, what are the financial indicators, the behavioral indicators of students running into financial problems 6 months, 9 months, 12 months before they eventually are going to drop out for financial reasons? Because if we can intervene then, we have a much better chance of actually making a change that is going to result in a positive impact. So what we found are there are all kinds of indicators out there in the data. For a long time we thought if a student didn't turn in forms on time, that meant they were lazy. What we increasingly appreciate is when students don't turn in forms on time, there's often a substantive reason why they don't turn in forms on time, right? It's because dad's not available to sign this form and I don't know what to do. And so by looking at the students who are late and not turning things on time, we found that we can target interventions. I mentioned just a moment ago that some of the mistakes that students make that lead to them dropping out of college for financial reasons they make before they ever set foot in their first class. Here's an example. We found a huge gap between the efforts of our financial aid office and the efforts of our housing office on campus. Students would get packaged by financial aid, packaged in a way that would plausibly get them through the entire academic year, through loans and grants and all these other resources. And financial aid would say, good, you're set to go. And that same student would walk a couple blocks down campus and go into the housing office, and rather than saying, I'm going to live off campus, or rather than saying, I'm going to share a dorm room with 3 roommates, would say, I'd like that single room. And not realize that what that student has just done is sealed the fate, had basically indicated that rather than getting through your first year, you're going to be running out of resources in February or March and having to drop out for financial reasons. But again, whose fault was that? Yeah, we would love our 17-year-old, mostly first generation, mostly low-income student body to have the wherewithal to know I can't afford that single room. But we were taking no responsibility for that as a campus. So now what we're doing is beginning to look at those kind of indicators and say to these students, look, do you know that last night you made a decision that could lead to you dropping out of the university by picking that single room? And although we can't force you to do it, maybe you want to reconsider the housing expenses to bring it in more consistency with the resources that have been compiled. So all told, and we will share these slides because I know you won't have the chance to mark all these down, we've found about 16 different data-based markers that are early indicators that students are running into financial distress. And I can say, just like our actions on the academic side of things, where for years we were passive, students may be accounting majors and underperforming in math courses, but we'll sit back and hopefully everything will work out. No, it didn't. We saw big gains when we began intervening proactively. So too with some of these early warning signs of financial distress. Students who have holds for financial reasons, turning things in late, beginning to run into issues with SAP. All these sorts of things, if you begin to target them earlier, you have the promise of beginning to reverse what might be some really negative tendencies. And then very recently, in a collaboration with EAB, and I know a number of the campuses are already using EAB for their academic advising platform, we've begun to import some of those early warning signs onto the academic advisor screens. So here's one of the problems. You have academic advisors meeting with students on your campus on a day-to-day basis. The students are asking legitimate questions. I'm in the middle of the semester. I'm taking this course. I'm not doing well. I'm thinking about dropping it. Should I drop it or not? Or I'm in my junior year. I've all of a sudden got really interested in this field. I'm thinking adding a double major. Should I add it? And advisors across your campus, I know it's true of our campus too, are readily giving advice about those matters, but they're blind to the financial implications. All of you in financial aid know that you can't advise a student whether they should drop a course or not unless you know something about their SAP status, right? Whether that's going to be the difference between them qualifying for financial aid or not. And you can't give students good advice about whether they should add a second major unless you know something about how much eligibility they have remaining on their scholarships or their Pell Grants or whatever sort of aid package involved. So what we're finally doing, and EAB has been a good partner in this, is taking some of those markers, not putting in the academic advisor's hands all the details of students' finances. We don't think that they have any need to know all the details, but an academic advisor does need to know if a student is running out of eligibility or about to fall out of compliance with SAP. And now every time that one of our academic advisors look at the advising screen and sit down with a student, they're also seeing these financial markers as well and able to give much more holistic support. Third strategy is help students to hold on to the aid that they already have. This was something we learned early at Georgia State. We are so resource poor in many ways. We don't have enough scholarship money by any means to go around to all the students that have it. Why don't we get more intentional about helping students hold on to the aid they already have? In the state of Georgia, the biggest state scholarship by far is the Hope Scholarship, a great program. It basically goes to students, it covers at Georgia State about 80% of tuition for students who finish high school in a high school in Georgia with a 3.0 GPA and maintain that 3.0 GPA in college. So here we're going back in time again to when I first started in this position back in 2008, and we saw this data was really sobering. For the students who came in on the Hope Scholarship and were able to hold on to that 3.0 GPA, they were graduating at a rate 40 percentage points higher than the students who came on the Hope Scholarship and were not able to maintain a 3.0 GPA. In a sense, they were equally qualified coming in. Both groups of students had a high-performing level in high school. They had at least a 3.0 GPA in high school. But a 40% difference between those who held on the scholarship and those who didn't. Why? Because although the scholarship is labeled a merit scholarship in Georgia, it's also, for most of our students, an access scholarship, right? The only way they can enroll at Georgia State is by the Hope Scholarship. So you take it away, and these students are walking away. So what we began to do is run some scenarios. Our first idea was, well, can we fill in the gap between what a student loses with the Hope Scholarship and what they need so that we can pull that graduation rate for the students who lose the Hope Scholarship up those 40 points as well? Well, it's a daunting prospect. It's millions, it's over $20 million a year in scholarship money that Georgia State students alone lose by their GPA dropping below a 3.0 and losing the state scholarship. So we started this simple idea. We call the program Keep Hope Alive. You can learn some more about it tomorrow in one of the breakouts. But it's a simple $500 a semester grant for 2 semesters to students. They sign a contract. In order to get that $500, they have to agree to do certain things. like attend academic skills workshops, sit down one-on-one with their academic advisors, meet with financial counselors, because we found one of the things students do when they lose their scholarships is make really rash financial decisions, like I'm going to put this all on a credit card with no plan for paying it off, so that a few months later they're in collections and even harder to turn their prospects around. Overall at Georgia State, only about 9% of the students who ever lose the Hope Scholarship gain it back again by pulling their GPA above the level at the right time. And what started to happen with this simple program, $1,000 invested per student over 2 semesters, was that at first 30%, then 40%, now close to 60% of the students in this program are gaining the Hope Scholarship back again. And, happily, it began in, its first 5 years to have a significant impact upon graduation rates. So, as somebody who heads up student success, I would like to brag about this side where we raised for the students who hold on to the Hope Scholarship their graduation rates by 10 points, which is great. But this is really the important gain, right? Because it's a 20 percentage point increase, a doubling in effect of the graduation rate for the students who lose the Hope Scholarship, because they're finding a way in many cases to gain it back again, and once they gain it back again, their prospects of getting a college degree go up remarkably. Fourth, and final lesson I'm going to share with you this afternoon is don't allow students to walk away in the first place. This is national data that if a student stops out involuntarily from your institution for even a single semester for financial reasons, they only have about a 30% chance of ever coming back to your institution and completing their degree. So don't let them stop out for even a single semester for financial reasons. We had a big problem at Georgia State. This is 7-8 years ago, 2011. We were dropping over 1,000 students a semester who were completely academically qualified, met every requirement, were registered for classes and ready to go because they fell short of being able to pay their tuition and fee bill. 1,000 students a semester. When we looked at the data more closely, we found something even more disturbing, which is the biggest subset of those students were seniors. Students, by definition, within 2 semesters of graduating. Why? Because we enroll almost entirely low-income students, as you've seen, and these were the students who, even though they may have been doing everything right academically, so they were plugging away, taking the right courses, close to graduating within a semester or 2, they were running out of eligibility. The Hope Scholarship only covers 127 credit hours. You drop or withdraw a couple courses, or your job requires you to withdraw from a semester, you run short of the credit hours you need for a bachelor's degree. But our students were also running out of loan eligibility, Pell eligibility, and so forth, right before they crossed the finish line. So back in 2011, we started a program that was seen as very radical at the time. We call it Panther Retention Grants. Students have to do nothing. They don't have to come into any office. Part of the problem by requiring students to come into an office and raise their hand and request something is that you get more of the students who already feel empowered and fewer of the students who feel disenfranchised. So we just use data. We look at students who are academically good risk. This is not a scholarship program. You can have a 4.0 GPA or a 2.0 GPA and be equally qualified. You just need to be plugging away, taking the right courses, getting closer to graduation. We look at students who are within a semester or 2 of graduating and have a balance below $1,500, and we just put the money in their accounts. They don't do anything. We just put it in their accounts. We call them up and say, don't make any other plans Monday morning because you're not getting dropped. We just put this money in your account. First semester we did this, we had 40 students receiving these grants. Over the last 5-6 years, we're now up to over 11,000 students with these grants. Now, how have we been able to scale a program where we're giving money to students? At first, some people on campus thought we were crazy. This is money they owe us, we're just going to give it to them. What we found, and in fact the Gates Foundation sent Boston Consulting Group in to confirm this, is the program more than pays for itself. It's a net gainer financially for the institution. You give the students on average $900, which is about the average grant over the 7 years we've had this program, and you get back $900 immediately. Why? Because it's just covering a gap in the bill that they owe to the institution. But more than that, the average bill of somebody who gets a $900 grant as part of this program is $2,600. So they've already put $1,700 out of pocket or out of loans towards their cost. And that money, too, you recover, because if you drop them for the semester, you're going to lose all that income as well. So here you have a program that is not only morally the right thing to do, but actually fiscally prudent at the same time, a money generator. And the reality is it really works. Although 30% of the students who drop or stop out ever come back and graduate, 78% of the students who've gotten these grants over the last 6 or 7 years at Georgia State have graduated within 2 semesters. The last academic year alone, over 1,300 of our bachelor's recipients were recipients of this simple grant. You know, don't let these students walk away. So in conclusion, let me talk about some of the impacts in aggregate. What happens when you begin to use data more aggressively and more proactively in order to help your students? Well, some of the changes are at the micro level, and I'm going to start with those. One of the things we began seeing is because we were much more proactive in giving students timely advice and making sure they were following our insane bureaucracy in the most efficient way possible, is a significant drop in average time to degree. So we launched a lot of these analytics platforms in 2011 and 12, and we immediately see the number of credit hours that students are accumulating in order to complete their bachelor's requirements going down. Not because we've lowered any graduation requirements, but because students are taking fewer wasted credit hours and getting through the requirements more efficiently. So over the last 5 years, we've trimmed, on average, about a half a semester off the average time it takes a Georgia State student to get a bachelor's degree. If you think that doesn't matter to the families and to, as Brian was talking about, the long-term financial health of your graduates, that's savings in about $15 million in tuition and fees for this year's graduating class compared to the graduating classes before we began these proactive programs and interventions. Another kind of micro change that we began to see. I shared this chart earlier. This is 2008, the correlation between our levels of unmet need at Georgia State and the ability to hold on to a 3.0 GPA. Direct correlation. As unmet need went up, academic performance went down. That's 2008. This is 2016, the same data. It's still really beneficial for a student to have all of their need met. In fact, look at that. Georgia State University, not noted to be an elite institution when it comes to graduation rates, 90% of the students who have all their need met are graduating and graduating on time. But what I'm proud about, and you do have to be a bit of a data geek to appreciate this, is look how nice and flat that line is once it dips. So that correlation, we've been able to counter the correlation that historically exists, that as the unmet need goes up, the academic performance will go down. What about some more universal and macro indicators? Well, how about this one? Over the last 6 years, Georgia State, despite all those demographic changes that would suggest to the pundits that our success rate should be going down, twice as many low-income students, more students of color, and so forth, we're conferring 2,800 more degrees every year than we were as recently as 2011, a 67% increase. But look at where those gains have come from. So this is basically over the same time period. The gains have come from all the students that struggled the most under the bureaucracy in the past. So we're up 67% overall, but up over 100% for our black students, over 130% or almost 130% for our low-income students, 160% for our Latino Hispanic students. Not because any one of the programs is targeted to any of those populations. We're not doing a big African-American male this or Latino that or a Pell that. You know, it's distributing the same sort of support and interventions through chatbots, through proactive outreach and so forth to all students equally. But the students who benefited the most are the students who struggled the most under the old bureaucracy. And when it comes to those graduation rates we started with 30 minutes ago, the blue boxes where we were back in 2003, the graduation rates have not improved incrementally, they've improved exponentially. We've more than doubled our graduation rate for black students. We've close to tripled it for our Latino students. We've more than tripled it for African American male students. And there are no longer achievement gaps. For each of the last 3 years at Georgia State, our black, our Latino, our first generation, and our low-income students have all graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. And you know, this institution in the shadow of the Martin Luther King district that was segregated into the 1960s and grossly underserving our students of color as recently as a decade ago, now, and for each of the last 5 years, has conferred more bachelor's degrees to African American students than any other college or university in the United States. And you know, we started a little while ago looking at the financial inequities that are increasingly part of the national fabric. And you wouldn't be in this room tonight and part of this conference over the next day if you didn't believe in the power of education. I'm a strong believer that there's no other instrument of social mobility that is as powerful as higher education. And Georgia State is an example of just that promise. We weren't always so, but we are today. The average Georgia State family, as the students enter, are from an annual household income of well below $30,000 a year. According to a Brookings Institute study using Stanford and IRS data that came out this fall, the average Georgia State student 15 years after first enrollment is making over $82,000 a year. Now, as you heard in the introduction, I'm a humanities perspective, so I'm not all about the money. But we all know that money translates into better health care, longer life expectancy, more life choices. The sons and daughters of those from better income families will have better education, better health care, and so forth. And so what we're doing is, and now we're #1 in Georgia and 25th in the nation, for taking students from the bottom quintile of the economic spectrum as they enter college and moving them by 15 years later to the upper half of Americans by annual household income. And that's the power we have. That's why what we do is so important. That's why the financial well-being and wellness, not just of our students, but our communities and our states and ultimately the nation, really hinge upon what we do. And so in conclusion, I'm going to move from the big numbers and the graphics to a story. This was campus just a few months ago. We actually had Bill Gates invite himself to come to campus. So we didn't invite him. His people reached out to us and said, we're doing all this stuff with analytics and data, and we're succeeding with underserved populations. He'd really love to come to learn more about it. And it wasn't a ceremonial visit. He didn't visit the president or provost. He spent his whole time, about 3 hours on campus, with me, my colleague Allison Calhoun Brown, and then 4 of our students who had been exposed to these programs and so forth. Fascinated, learning all about them. And, we picked out students for him to meet, 4 students, each of whom had been touched by one of the programs that I've outlined this afternoon. You might not guess by looking at that picture which of the students he met was least likely to have been there. But it was almost doubtlessly Austin, this young man on the far right. Austin came from a background that we didn't appreciate until after we picked him. We picked him, by the way, because he used the chatbot over 40 times in the summer between high school and starting at Georgia State. But we found the story out when we interviewed him for the visit with Bill Gates. First-generation family, very low income. His father was in the military. When he left the military, his father ran a fruit and vegetable stand in northwest Georgia. Nobody in his family had ever gone to college before. That alone would indicate his chances of being in the room at a major public university speaking to Bill Gates were not particularly high. But then what happened to Austin is when he's 11 or so years old, his father is diagnosed with ALS. And it begins a 3-year period where every day after school, he has to come directly home because he has to care for his father while his mother leaves to do a night job to bring income into the family. And he becomes the man of the house. And sadly, when he's about 14, his father passes away from ALS. And he remembers a time his mother had lost her job in the last period of the father's illness because it became so consuming to care for him. And he remembers a time when she was at the kitchen table with all her resumes spread out across the table in tears because she couldn't get back into the job market. And her lament was that everybody who's getting hired has a college degree and I don't have any education. So this very exceptional 14-year-old who is already overcoming just about every obstacle vows to himself, I'm going to earn a scholarship and make sure I get a college degree so the same thing doesn't happen to me. And despite all the odds, amazingly, he not only graduates from high school, he graduates, and those in Georgia will know what this means, with a Zell-Miller Scholarship. The Zell-Miller Scholarship is the highest state scholarship, goes to the top 1% of graduating high school seniors. So you not only have to be an A student, you have to ace your SATs and really do well. And Austin does this, in this household of all this disruption and turmoil. And, he comes to Georgia State and decides this is the perfect fit for him. This is where he wants to be. Everything looks great. He gets into Georgia State, not surprisingly, and is all ready to come to for the fall until he gets his first bill for the fall semester. And he takes a look at it, and it's literally $4,000 or $5,000 more than he was expecting it to be. And he knows there's no way that his mother and his family can cover that. And like a lot of first-generation low-income students, he immediately blames himself. He says, oh, what an idiot I am. You know, I must have misunderstood what the way these bills are calculated. I must have done something wrong. But because Austin was trying to enroll for fall of 16 rather than fall of 15, we actually had that chatbot available. So he starts using the chatbot and tries to figure out what's going on, asking all kinds of questions, hence the 40 exchanges there, and figures out that in the Georgia Student Finance Office, which distributes the Hope Scholarship and the Zell Miller Scholarship, 2 of his Social Security numbers had been transposed. And that big scholarship he was supposed to get didn't apply to his account after all. And so he figures this out. He's so relieved, he tells his mother, and even though 99% of Georgia State students now pay for their bills online, the 2 of them decide, no, we're not going to leave this up to chance. They come down to campus, they go to our cashier's office, they pay in person, they get the receipts showing that it's all paid and he's ready to go for the summer. He says his mother is literally in tears, while they're paying this bill. And my favorite moment of the Bill Gates visit was because Austin was our in-house expert on the chatbot, we had Austin show Bill Gates how to use the chatbot. I will tell you, Bill Gates was fascinated. He spent 15 minutes asking different questions and so forth. My favorite moment, though, is Austin is sitting down with Bill Gates. His first lines to him are, I must admit, sir, it's rather humbling to be teaching software to you. But, just to put a footnote on our opening session and then, set us off to prepare for dinner and what's happening tomorrow, what we're doing, it's about analytics, it's about data, but at heart, it's about Austin. It's about making sure that we don't screw up to the point where somebody who's doing everything right, despite all the odds, gets left out of all the opportunity and all the promise of education. The last thing they did with Bill Gates is took the requisite, selfie, the students with Bill Gates pausing there. And what a poorer world it would be if we, were taking pictures like that and Austin wasn't standing there. And that's the power, we have in our hands. We have the power through our efforts, hopefully through our innovation, through our attempts to serve our students better, to make the difference between somebody like Austin sitting on the sidelines throughout, a college career, or being there, beside Bill Gates. He's happily just finished his, his sophomore year here at Georgia State and is doing fantastic. So, I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate it personally because this is an area I feel, as you've probably picked up, very passionately about. But I really appreciate it because of Austin and all the thousands and tens of thousands of Austins who are enrolled at all your institutions represented across this room. They are deserving of our best efforts. They are deserving of better than we've done historically. And I think the promise of that better future is sitting right in this room tonight. So thank you very much for your attention, and thanks for being here.